The cop slammed her into the nurse's station so hard the monitors rattled. 28 staff members stood watching. Not one of them moved. Officer Derek Marsh pressed his forearm across her collarbone, leaning in close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, and said the words he'd said to a dozen nurses before her. The ones who'd flinched, apologized, gone quiet. "You're a nurse, sweetheart. Act like one." What Derek Marsh didn't know, what nobody in Harlow General knew, was that the woman he'd just shoved against a wall had once made life-or-death calls in conditions that would have broken him in under an hour. He thought he was putting a nurse in her place. He had just started a war with the wrong person. If you want to see exactly how this plays out, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain started around 6 p.m. By the time Nora Vasquez pulled into the parking structure at Harlow General Medical Center in Delwood, Missouri, it was coming down hard enough to blur the yellow lines on the asphalt. She sat in her car for exactly 40 seconds. She always counted, rolling her neck, loosening her shoulders, doing the small rituals she'd developed over 3 years of overnight ER shifts. It wasn't meditation, it wasn't anything spiritual. It was just her way of drawing a line between the person she was in that parking garage and the person she had to be the moment those sliding glass doors opened. She grabbed her badge off the dash and clipped it to her scrubs. Nora Vasquez, RN, Emergency Department. She turned 31 in April. She lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on Keller Street, owned a second-hand coffee maker she'd never bothered to replace, and kept her personal life so quiet that most of the staff at Harlow General knew almost nothing about her beyond the fact that she was excellent at her job and didn't take unnecessary nonsense from anyone. That last part had gotten her into trouble before. Tonight, it would do it again. Tip. The ER at Harlow General was the kind of unit that separated people quickly. The ones who could handle pressure and the ones who only thought they could. 12 beds, 2 trauma bays, 1 attending physician who was perpetually behind on charting, and a nursing staff that held the whole machine together with sheer collective will. Nora had worked harder floors, in harder conditions, in harder places than this. She knew better than to say that out loud. The staff here were good people. They didn't need her history to respect her, and she didn't need their curiosity about it. She moved through the handoff without drama, checked her assignment board, reviewed the night census, traded 2 sentences with the departing charge nurse, and got to work. Bed 4 was a 67-year-old with chest pressure and an abnormal EKG. Bed 7 was a 22-year-old with a laceration across her palm from a broken glass that needed cleaning and closing. Bed 9 was holding for labs. Normal enough. For now. She was starting her secondary assessment on the chest pressure patient when she first heard Derek Marsh. Not heard him directly. Heard the change in the room, the way noise flattens when a particular kind of authority enters a space, the small collective tightening of shoulders. She'd learned to read those shifts years ago, in environments where reading them wrong could get someone killed. In this ER, the stakes were different, but the physics of fear were the same. She glanced toward the corridor. Officer Derek Marsh was walking the main hall like he owned every square foot of it, thumbs in his belt, chin high. He was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and had since hardened into something that looked like authority if you didn't know better. His uniform was pressed. His boots were polished. He came to Harlow General 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes with a prisoner transport, sometimes following up on a reported incident, sometimes, it seemed, for no reason that anyone could identify beyond the fact that nobody had told him he wasn't welcome. He talked to staff the way some people talk to customer service representatives, with an underlying assumption that they existed to accommodate him. Nora had encountered him once before, briefly, 2 weeks into her time at Harlow General. He'd reached across the nurse's station to grab a form from the printer without asking, made a comment she didn't remember word for word, but remembered the tone of, and moved on. She'd filed him in the back of her mind under problem, not yet my problem, and left it there. Tonight, that file was about to reopen. She heard it before she saw it. A raised voice, male, sharp, carrying that particular edge that comes not from actual urgency, but from a person used to using volume as leverage. She finished her notation on bed 4, excused herself from the patient, and moved toward the sound with a neutral expression that cost her something to maintain. The scene was in the corridor between Trauma Bay 2 and the supply alcove. A man was seated in a wheelchair, hunched forward, both hands wrapped around his own forearms, head down. He was older, maybe 60, wearing clothes that had been rained on and worn for too many days in a row. A plastic hospital bracelet was already on his wrist, which meant he'd been checked in, which meant he was officially a patient, which meant he had rights that existed regardless of what Officer Derek Marsh thought about his smell, or his address, or his military-issue jacket with the fraying sleeve. Marcus Webb, Nora would learn his name later, had come in through the ER entrance after being found on a bench 3 blocks from the hospital. One of the intake nurses had clocked his fever, and his hands, shaking badly, the right one swollen and dark around 2 fingers, and had him checked in for assessment. That assessment hadn't happened yet because Marsh was currently in the way. "I'm telling you he doesn't need a bed," Marsh was saying to a young male aide who looked like he was trying very hard not to make eye contact with either the cop or the patient. "He needs to go to the shelter on Clement. That's where these guys go." "He was checked in," the aide said, voice careful. "He has a bracelet." "I can see that. I'm saying it was probably a mistake." Marsh looked at Marcus Webb like he was a problem to be reclassified. "You got somewhere to be tonight, buddy? Clement Street has cots." Marcus Webb didn't answer. He was looking at the floor. His right hand was shaking. Nora stopped 3 feet away. She took in the situation in the time it took her to exhale. The patient's posture, the color of the swollen fingers, the slight forward lean that suggested it was painful to breathe deeply, the way he was holding absolutely still in the way people do when they've learned that moving draws attention, and attention rarely helps them. "He's my patient," she said. Marsh turned. He looked at her badge, then at her face, in the sequence that told her exactly what she needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. "You're the nurse?" "I am. And he was admitted for assessment, so I'm going to need you to give us space to complete that." Marsh tilted his head. Not a question, a challenge. "He doesn't need assessment. He needs a ride to Clement. That's not a medical determination you're qualified to make." She kept her voice level. Not cold, level. There was a difference, and she was careful about it. "His hand has signs of infection, and he's running a fever. We need to examine him." "He was fine when I found him." "What's his BP?" Marsh stared at her. "His blood pressure," Nora said. "If you've assessed him, tell me his BP, his oxygen sat, his temperature. Because those are the things that tell us whether someone needs a bed or a shuttle, and unless you've got a stethoscope I'm not seeing, you don't have that information." The aide behind Marsh had gone very still. Somewhere behind Nora, she was aware of at least 2 other nurses who'd stopped pretending not to watch. Marsh took a slow step toward her. Not threatening, or at least not in a way he could be formally called on. Just enough to close the distance. His voice dropped. Not quieter, but somehow more contained, like a pressure system pulling inward. "Listen, I've been coming to this hospital for 6 years. I know how this place works. I know which calls are real and which ones are resource drains. And I'm telling you, Derek." The voice came from behind Nora. She didn't turn. Dr. Amos Garrett, the attending on shift, was standing at the edge of the corridor with a tablet in one hand and the expression of a man who had navigated this particular intersection before and had reached his own private conclusions about how to survive it. He was 53, gray at the temples, with the mild, perpetually tired look of someone who had learned to pick battles carefully. "Let the team do the intake," Garrett said. Not a confrontation. A suggestion. Phrased with just enough deference to let Marsh feel like he was still choosing. Marsh held Nora's gaze for 2 full seconds before he stepped back. "Your hospital," he said, spreading his hands like it was a generous concession. "Your problem." He walked away. Nora turned to Marcus Webb, crouched to his eye level, and said quietly, "Hi, my name's Nora. Can you tell me how long your hand's been looking like that?" But Marcus Webb had 2 fractured fingers, an infected wound on his palm that had gone untreated for at least 4 days, a fever of 103.2, and the early stages of cellulitis creeping up toward his wrist. He'd been a combat engineer. Desert deployment, early 2000s. Honorable discharge. The jacket wasn't for show. Nora worked his intake with a quiet efficiency that she didn't perform for anyone. It was just how she operated. She talked to him like a person, which seemed to surprise him. She cleaned the wound carefully. She got his fever medications ordered, his IV started, his antibiotics cued. She called for radiology to rule out deeper bone involvement in the fingers and flagged the case for the social work team that wouldn't arrive until morning. By the time she was done, Marcus Webb had said maybe 30 words total, but when she told him she'd be back to check on him, he looked up and held eye contact for a moment in a way that said more than the words would have. She noted it without reacting, moved on. The next 2 hours ran the way ER hours do. Not smoothly, but constantly. A toddler with a bead lodged in her nostril, a 39-year-old with a dislocated shoulder from a fall on wet stairs, 2 walk-ins who needed wound care and waited without complaint. Nora moved between them with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had long since stopped finding chaos unusual and had simply learned to operate inside it. She was updating the chart on the shoulder patient when she became aware of Marsh again. Not because she heard him, but because she saw the aide from earlier making himself small near the supply room door, the same posture as before. Marsh was at the nurse's station. He was talking to Sandra Pickard, the charge nurse, a woman Nora had quickly identified as competent and well-meaning and deeply conflict-averse in the way that institutions quietly reward. Sandra was nodding with the expression of someone absorbing information they don't want and don't know how to refuse. Nora finished her notation, walked to the station. "Shouldn't have been admitted in the first place," Marsh was saying. "I'm telling you, this is becoming a pattern with your night team. They take in everyone who walks through the door without thinking about, 'Is there something medical happening right now?'" Nora asked. Marsh stopped, turned. "Because if there is," she continued, moving behind the station and pulling up a chart, "I'm happy to assist. If this is a policy conversation, it probably needs to go through administration." "Nora," Sandra's voice had a careful edge. "I'm just clarifying." Nora looked at Marsh directly. "Are you here on a call?" "I'm here," Marsh said, "because I've been coming to this ER for 6 years, and I have concerns about the way intakes are being handled." "Then those concerns should go in writing to the department director. That's the process." She held his gaze. "Is there anything else I can help you with tonight?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted those too. Marsh's jaw moved slightly, like he was deciding something. Then he pointed at her badge, a small gesture, almost casual, but not. "Vasquez, how long have you been here?" "Long enough." "Right." He let the word sit. "Long enough." He glanced at Sandra. "We'll talk later." He walked out. Sandra exhaled. "Nora, I know. He has a relationship with administration here, with Donnelly specifically." Richard Donnelly was the hospital's operations director. Nora had met him once, briefly, at a staff orientation that she'd attended because she was new and hadn't yet figured out which meetings were mandatory and which ones were theater. "I hear you," Nora said. "I'm just saying, he's going to make noise." He was already making noise. She clicked to the next chart. At least now he knows someone's listening. Sandra gave her the look that people give when they believe you're right and are fairly certain it won't protect you. She wasn't wrong. The call came through administration at 10:47 p.m. Nora was in the middle of a dressing change when Sandra found her, not interrupting, just appearing in the doorway with the expression that had replaced her usual careful neutrality. Something harder now. Something that looked almost like apology. "Donnelly wants to see you." Nora finished taping the dressing, told the patient she'd be back, stripped her gloves. Richard Donnelly's office was on the 2nd floor, a space that managed to feel both administrative and oddly carpeted, full of the kind of furniture that communicated I make decisions without saying anything about what those decisions were or who they protected. He was behind his desk when she entered. Marsh was sitting in the chair to the right. Nora didn't react to that. She sat down. Donnelly was a trim man in his late 50s with silver hair and the practiced neutrality of a person who had learned to stay out of direct confrontations by positioning himself above them. "Nora," he said, like they were old colleagues. "Thanks for coming up." "Of course." "Officer Marsh has raised some concerns about an interaction this evening." "I assumed." Donnelly's eyes moved to Marsh briefly, then back. "He feels the intake of the patient in question, the unhoused individual, wasn't handled appropriately, and that when he raised those concerns, he was met with some hostility from staff. I asked him whether there was an active medical situation requiring his presence," Nora said. "That's a standard triage question." "It came across as dismissive," Marsh said from the chair. "I've been coming to this hospital." "For 6 years, yes." She looked at him. "I'm aware." Donnelly shifted. "Nora, Officer Marsh has a long-standing working relationship with this department. He provides an important security function and—" "With respect," Nora said, and she meant it to sound exactly as measured as it did, "Officer Marsh was in a clinical corridor attempting to redirect a patient who had already been admitted and assessed as requiring treatment. The patient's infection required IV antibiotics. Without intervention tonight, we would have been looking at a significantly worse presentation in 48 hours. She paused. "I don't know what the protocol is here for deferring to non-clinical personnel on intake decisions, but where I've worked before, there isn't one." Donnelly looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating. Marsh looked at her with something simpler. "I'm going to recommend," Donnelly said carefully, "that you take the rest of your shift off, with pay, just to let things settle. We're short-staffed tonight. I'm aware. Dr. Garrett can manage. He's already behind on—" "Nora," Donnelly's voice firmed slightly. "This isn't a request." She looked at him for a moment, then she stood. "Okay," she said. She walked out of the office, down the stairwell, back toward the ER to retrieve her bag from the locker room. She moved through it all without rushing, without showing anything on her face, because the face was a tool and she'd learned to control it in situations where losing control of it cost lives. This wasn't that, but old training didn't ask about stakes. She was 5 feet from the locker room door when the sound reached her. It started as a PA tone, the overhead kind that the ER used for high-priority alerts, and then, almost simultaneously, the radio on the hip of a security guard near the entrance crackled with something that made him stand up straight. Through the glass sliding doors at the front of the ER, she could see the first set of lights, red and white, blue and white, the chaotic strobe of multiple emergency vehicles arriving in sequence rather than alone. Her bag was in the locker room. She didn't go get it. She turned and walked toward the trauma bays. The first gurney came through the doors 40 seconds later. Adult male, mid-30s, burns across the left arm and neck, lacerations on the face and scalp from what the paramedic, moving fast, talking fast, barely looking up, described as shrapnel. Multiple vehicle incident, Route 9, and the Harlow Industrial Connector. We've got at least 6 critical, 12 serious, and the count's still moving. Nora was already at the gurney rail. What's his pressure? 78/50 on scene. We pushed fluids. Airway? Intact, but he's fighting. Get me 2 large bore IVs and a pressure bag. Now. She was talking to the aide who'd appeared at her left shoulder, and the command in her voice wasn't volume, but it was specificity, the kind that cuts through noise because it leaves no room for interpretation. The aide moved. The second gurney came in before the first was stabilized. Then a third. The ER, which had been managing a reasonable overnight load 20 minutes ago, was now filling the way. Water fills a container, rapidly, from every angle, with no regard for capacity. Dr. Garrett appeared at her side, looked at the board, looked at the gurneys, looked at her. He did not ask about Donnelly's instructions. "What have you got?" he said. She told him. He nodded. They moved. For the next 40 minutes, Nora functioned on the part of her nervous system that had been built for exactly this. Not through willpower, not through training she'd gotten at Harlow General, but through something older and harder, buried deep enough that most days she didn't feel its weight. She moved between patients with the kind of triage logic that wasn't textbook. It was faster than textbook, more intuitive, shaped by the specific knowledge of what the body does when it's failing and what it needs in the next 60 seconds versus the next 6 minutes. She caught a missed tension pneumothorax on a male patient who'd been marked as stable. She talked a terrified young woman through a cervical stabilization procedure when the paramedic who'd started it had to break off for another arrival. She managed 2 simultaneous critical assessments without losing either thread. She didn't think about Donnelly. She didn't think about Marsh. She didn't think about much of anything except the immediate physical reality of each patient in front of her, the data her hands and eyes were collecting, and what needed to happen in the next moment to keep that person alive. She was at the second trauma bay, hands occupied, voice clear, directing, when she became aware of the vehicles that had pulled into the hospital's service entrance on the east side. Not ambulances. The sound was different, heavier. The lights through the corridor window were different too. White, high, fixed rather than strobing. Military transport vehicles. She registered this the way she registered everything in a mass casualty situation. Filed it, kept moving, let it sit in the background until it became relevant. It became relevant faster than she expected. The first person through the service entrance doors was a man in tactical medical gear, the kind worn by personnel attached to field medical units, moving with the efficient practiced stride of someone who'd done triage in environments that made this ER look small. Behind him came 4 others similarly dressed, carrying cases she recognized by shape and size before she could read the markings. The man in front stopped when he reached the edge of the trauma bay. He was scanning the room the way you scan a room when you're trying to understand it fast. Where the bottlenecks were, where the flow was breaking down, what the space could handle and what it couldn't. Nora had done the same thing approximately 45 seconds after arriving. Then his scan stopped. He was looking at her. She was elbow deep in a secondary assessment, hadn't looked up, was talking in the clipped shorthand of trauma communication. But she felt the stillness in the way people sometimes feel being watched. Not paranoia, just awareness. She finished her sentence, handed off to the nurse beside her, and looked up. The man in tactical gear was Staff Sergeant Reuben Cross. She knew that not because of any insignia she could read from this distance, but because she knew his face. She'd known it for 8 years. He wasn't moving. He was looking at her the same way she was looking at him, with the specific recognition of 2 people who have shared something that doesn't have a name in ordinary civilian life, and therefore never really gets discussed. From somewhere behind her, she heard the voice she'd been ignoring since he'd walked back into the ER 20 minutes ago. Marsh, talking to someone on his phone, moving toward the bay, saying something about unauthorized personnel and proper chain of... Cross looked past her for just a moment, at Marsh, then back at her. He said nothing yet. But the 4 people behind him had already started moving, opening cases, reading the room, integrating into the space with the seamless efficiency of a team that had done this kind of thing in locations where the walls were less solid and the lights were less reliable. And Marsh, who had stopped at the edge of the bay, was looking at the gear in the vehicles and the number of people who had just walked in with a particular kind of authority that he had never, in 6 years at Harlow General, had to figure out how to override. The room had shifted. Nora turned back to her patient. She had 6 more people who needed her, and whatever was coming, whatever Cross being here meant, whatever Marsh was going to do with the next 60 seconds, it would happen around her work, not instead of it. Her hands were already moving. The patient in front of her, a man somewhere in his late 40s, soot-blackened from the collar down, with a burn pattern across his left forearm that told her he'd been inside the vehicle rather than near it, was trying to pull off his oxygen mask. She caught his wrist without looking up from the monitor, applied gentle downward pressure, and said, "Leave it," in the tone that wasn't unkind but left no room for negotiation. He stopped pulling. She kept going. Behind her, she could hear Marsh's voice trying to find purchase in a situation that had suddenly grown too large for him to shape. "I need someone to explain to me who authorized this, who called them in, because I've been on the radio with dispatch, and there's no record of a military medical request to this facility." Nobody answered him directly. That was its own kind of answer. Cross had moved to the secondary trauma bay. He was talking quietly with Dr. Garrett, not over him, not around him, with him, in the flat, technical shorthand of 2 people who both understood the problem and were already solving it. Nora caught fragments between the sounds of monitors and carts and the particular human noise of a room full of people in serious pain trying not to make too much of it. 3 of ours in the convoy. 2 are critical. One's... I've got Bay 2 opening up in 4 minutes. She know what we're working with? A pause. Ask her, Garrett said. Cross walked over. He waited until she'd handed off her current patient's chart to the floor nurse before he spoke, and she appreciated that. The reading of the room, the understanding that there was a hierarchy of urgency that had nothing to do with rank or history. Vasquez, he said, how bad is your supply situation? Blood's going to be the problem in the next 20 minutes, she said, not turning around. She was already moving toward Bay 2. We've got 3 units of O-neg on hand, maybe 2 more that pharmacy can turn around fast. After that, we're calling for emergency transport from Mercy North. We brought a portable storage unit, 6 units O-neg, 4 APOS, 2 B-neg. She stopped, looked at him. That's going to matter. Yeah. You're early, she said. It wasn't a question exactly. We were staging 4 miles out for a different incident when the Route 9 call went out. He paused. I didn't know you were here. I know. He held her look for a second. Not long, just enough to acknowledge that there was a conversation sitting beneath this one that neither of them was going to have in the middle of a mass casualty event. And then he turned back toward his team. Nora turned back toward her work. Marsh had moved to the corridor just outside the main trauma space, and he was on his phone now. She could see him through the interior window, pacing, tight-jawed, one hand moving while he talked. Whatever he was doing, it wasn't helping anyone in front of her, which meant she filed it away and kept going. The next 45 minutes were the kind that collapsed time. You weren't tracking minutes when it was happening. You were tracking breath sounds and pressures and the color of skin and the specific quality of someone's grip when they were losing consciousness versus when they were just afraid. You were tracking which patient needed you in the next 30 seconds and which one could hold for 2 minutes and which one was already beyond what this room could do and needed to be told that clearly and with as much steadiness as you could put in your voice. She'd done this kind of triage before, not in an ER. In conditions where the ceiling was fabric and the floor was compacted dirt, and the noise outside the tent was not the sound of traffic, but the sound of things that had no civilian equivalent. She didn't think about that, not consciously. It was just the background architecture of how her brain was built now, the way certain kinds of experience rewire the response system so thoroughly that it stops feeling like memory and starts feeling like instinct. A 26-year-old woman, civilian, passenger in one of the vehicles, came in with a splenic injury that the paramedics had underestimated because her pressure was holding. Nora caught it on the rebound assessment, the way her pressure had been artificially maintained by the body's compensatory mechanics, the specific pattern of the pain response, the rigidity in the upper left quadrant. She called for a surgical consult before the attending had finished reviewing the paramedic notes. Garrett looked at her. She's compensating, Nora said. She won't be in another 15 minutes. He ordered the consult. The surgeon arrived 8 minutes later. The woman went to the OR within 20. She would survive. None of that felt like heroism in the moment. It felt like math. It was around the 90-minute mark when the other thing happened. She was at the station updating a chart, one of the few minutes she'd had to sit in the past hour and a half, when Sandra appeared at her elbow. Her expression had changed again, and Nora had learned Sandra's expressions well enough by now to read this one as something different from the earlier apology. This one had a harder edge. "Donnelly's downstairs," Sandra said quietly. Nora kept typing. "I know. Nora, he's talking about having security escort you out, formally. Marsh apparently called him and said you were insubordinate and that you defied a direct administrative order to leave the premises. I came back for a mass casualty event. I know that. He knows that. I think he's trying to figure out how to handle the military presence without admitting he doesn't have authority over it. And Marsh is pushing him to do something visible, and you're the visible thing." Nora looked up from the chart. "How many patients do we still have in active critical status?" Sandra checked the board. 4. "And how many staff?" "We're short, 2. Jamila went home sick at midnight, and Marcus is... Then I'm staying until there are enough people to cover those 4. She turned back to the chart. "Donnelly can come tell me himself." Sandra left. Nora kept typing. Donnelly did not come tell her himself. Not yet. But she knew it was coming the way you know weather is coming. Not because you can see it, but because the air changes. Cross found her at the medication station at midnight. He'd done what he always did in operational situations, made himself useful without requiring instruction, integrated his team's resources with the existing staff in a way that reduced friction rather than creating it. Two of his medics were in the secondary bay working alongside Garrett. One was managing the portable blood storage. He'd been everywhere in the last hour and a half, and nowhere that he wasn't needed. "You're three," he said, nodding toward the far end of the corridor. Three of the military personnel who'd come in with the convoy were in the final exam room, all stable now, but one with a leg fracture that was going to need a surgical consult in the morning. "They're going to be okay." "Good." She was pulling a medication tray together and doing the math on dosage for a patient 2 rooms over. "Cross." "Yeah." "Why were you staging in Delwood?" He was quiet for a second. "Training exercise, regional emergency response coordination. In the middle of the night. Exercises run when they run." She looked at him sideways. He had the same face she remembered, the kind that revealed exactly as much as he decided to reveal, and nothing beyond that. She'd always found it irritating and also, in a specific operational context, reassuring. "You know this is going to get complicated," she said. "How so?" "The cop who was here when your unit arrived, he's been," she paused, chose her words carefully, "embedded in this hospital's culture for a while, in ways that don't benefit patients. I noticed." His voice was flat. "He has administration on his side." "Administration might be reconsidering its position," Cross said. He let that sit for a moment and then added, "My CO is going to want a full incident report of tonight, which will include documentation of everything that happened in this facility during the mass casualty response." He picked up a supply case. "Everything." She looked at him for a long moment. "Go do your job," he said. Not dismissive, it was the same voice he'd used in the field when the conversation was over and the work was still in front of you. She went. Donnelly arrived at 12:47 a.m. She saw him before he saw her, coming down the main corridor from the elevator, in a pressed shirt that said he'd been woken up and had taken the time to get dressed properly before coming in, which told her something about how he processed authority and image. 2 steps behind him was Marsh, in full uniform, hands in his belt, chin at the angle she'd cataloged on the first night she met him. Nora was at the edge of Bay 1. The room had slowed in the last 20 minutes. Not empty, not calm, but the immediate storm wall of the mass casualty event had moved past its peak. The critical patients were either in the OR, transferred, or stabilized. What remained was ongoing care. Still necessary, still important, but no longer the kind of thing where every second was a crisis. She saw Donnelly clock the military personnel, saw him take in the cases and the gear and the number of people wearing tactical medical equipment in his ER. Saw his expression do the thing that expressions do when the situation is more complicated than the phone call had suggested. He stopped in front of her. "Nora," he said. "Mr. Donnelly. I think we need to," he glanced at Marsh, then back, "have a clearer conversation about tonight." "I agree." That seemed to surprise him slightly. He'd probably expected resistance first. "Officer Marsh has filed a formal complaint alleging that you defied a direct administrative order and created a hostile working environment for—" "How many patients did we intake tonight?" she asked. That's not 19 critical, 31 serious. 6 of the critical cases required immediate intervention that prevented escalation to fatality." She kept her voice even. "I can walk you through each one if you want, or we can talk about the complaint." Marsh stepped forward. "This isn't about the patients. This is about an employee who was told to leave. I was told to leave during a routine shift," Nora said. "The situation changed. You were suspended." "I wasn't suspended. I was told to take the rest of my shift off." She looked at Donnelly. "Those are different things administratively, and I'd encourage you to be specific about which one you meant if you're filing paperwork." Donnelly's jaw moved slightly. "Beyond that," she continued, What happened after I came back to the floor is documented in patient records, in the incident log, and apparently in the military unit's own after-action report, which their CO has indicated will be submitted to Regional Emergency Management. A beat. I'd be careful about how you characterize my conduct in any formal complaint, given that. Marsh made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Derek. Donnelly's voice was quiet. She's stating facts, Donnelly said. He didn't look happy about it. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he hadn't agreed to stand at the edge of. He turned back to Nora. His voice had lost some of its earlier precision. We'll table this until the morning, when things have settled. Of course, she said. He walked away. Marsh held her gaze for 3 seconds. She counted, and then followed. The ER went quiet somewhere after 2 a.m. Not silent. It never went fully silent. There were still patients, still monitors, still the sound of a ventilator in Bay 2 and the low murmur of staff doing the overnight work that nobody saw. But the pitch dropped, and in that drop there was space for the things the last 4 hours hadn't had room for. She sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that she didn't taste and let herself feel the exhaustion she'd been not feeling for the last several hours. Her hands had a faint tremor, not from fear, not from crisis, just from being that far into the operational end of her reserves. It happened. It had always happened. The trick was knowing it was coming and not letting it interfere with the work, and then letting it arrive when the work was done. Sandra came in and sat across from her, didn't say anything for a moment, just poured her own coffee. Reuben Cross, Sandra finally said. One of your people? We served in the same theater, different units, but overlapping operations. He seems like someone you'd want in your corner. Nora turned the cup in her hands. He's someone you'd want on your side of a room when the room gets complicated. And is this room complicated? Getting there? Sandra was quiet for another moment. Then, I should have said something tonight, before Donnelly. When Marsh, Sandra. No, you have a family here, Nora said. In this hospital, people you've protected for years by knowing which hills to die on and which ones to walk around. I'm not going to tell you that was wrong. She took a sip of the tasteless coffee. I made a different calculation. That's not better. It's just different. Sandra looked at her with something that wasn't quite admiration, more like recognition. The look people gave when they identified something they deliberately kept a distance from in themselves. What did you do before this? Sandra asked. Before Harlow General? Nora looked at the coffee cup. Medicine, she said. It wasn't a lie. But then, she was back on the floor at 2:30 because 2 of the night staff were running behind, and there were still 4 patients who needed active monitoring. She moved through the rooms quietly, the way night nursing moves, efficient, low impact, attuned to the specific needs of people who were hurting and trying to sleep at the same time. Marcus Webb was still in his room. The antibiotics were running, the fever had dropped 0.5 degree, and his right hand was elevated on a pillow with a fresh dressing. He was asleep when she checked on him, which was good. Sleep was doing work that the IV couldn't do. She updated his chart, checked the dressing for any bleed-through, and was turning to leave when he spoke. You came back. She stopped. His eyes were open, only barely. I did, she said. They told you to go. They did. He was quiet for a moment, then, why? She thought about how to answer that, and in the thinking realized she wasn't sure the answer was simple enough for 2 a.m. You needed the antibiotic timing managed correctly, she said, and I knew what I was looking at. He seemed to consider this. My unit called it something, he said, when people did the thing they were supposed to do even when it was inconvenient. He closed his eyes again. I forget the word. Get some sleep, she said. She pulled the door almost closed behind her and stood in the hallway for a moment. The corridor was quiet. A floor nurse moved past with a medication tray. Through the window at the end of the hall, the parking lot lights were still on, throwing pale circles on wet asphalt. She was halfway back to the station when she heard it. Not loud, coming from the direction of the service entrance. Voices. More than 2. A specific register that she associated with situations where something official was being established. She changed direction. At the service entrance, the same one the military convoy had used, there were now 4 people she didn't recognize. 2 in plain clothes with lanyards, 1 in a uniform that wasn't local law enforcement, state level by the insignia, and 1 in a suit who was talking to Staff Sergeant Cross with the particular posture of someone who had been sent rather than chosen to come. Cross saw her and gave the small nod that meant come here without making it obvious you've been called. She walked over at a normal pace. Ms. Vasquez, the man in the suit had a voice that went with the posture, controlled, professional, the kind that delivered difficult news without inflection. I'm with the Regional Emergency Management Office. We're doing an after-action review of tonight's incident, okay? We'll need to speak with you as part of that. It won't take long tonight. We can schedule a formal session for tomorrow morning, but there are a few things we're trying to establish regarding the timeline of events at this facility. He paused, including some things that predate the Route 9 incident. She looked at Cross briefly. His face gave her nothing, which itself told her something. What kind of things? She asked. The state officer spoke for the first time. We've received information from multiple sources suggesting that this facility has had an ongoing issue with the law enforcement officer using his access to interfere with patient care and staff operations. He paused. That information came to us through the military unit's incident report, which was flagged due to what Staff Sergeant Cross characterized as an active interference situation during an emergency response. Nora was still. One of Officer Marsh's own colleagues, the man in the suit said, submitted a supplementary report this evening, independently, before he knew we'd been contacted by the military unit. He let that sit for a moment. We're going to need your account of tonight's events, and we may need access to records going back further. She said, I'll cooperate fully. Good. He looked at his tablet. There's one other thing. Officer Marsh has apparently been made aware that this review is happening. He submitted a counter-complaint approximately 40 minutes ago alleging misconduct on your part. Specifically, that you misrepresented your credentials and qualifications to hospital administration during your hiring process. The corridor was very quiet. He's claiming, the suit continued, looking at her steadily, that your nursing license was obtained under, and I'm quoting his language, unusual circumstances, and that your employment at Harlow General was secured by omitting relevant prior history from your application. Nora held the man's gaze without blinking. That's what he's claiming, she said. Yes. The fluorescent light above them buzzed once, faintly, and went back to steady. Then I suppose, she said, you'll want to see my full record. The man in the suit looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not suspicion, not sympathy. More like someone who has walked into a room expecting it to be a certain size and is finding it significantly larger. We'll coordinate with your administrative contacts for documentation, but yes, if you're willing to provide full disclosure, I am, she said, completely calm, completely still. Cross, standing 3 feet to her left, said nothing, but she felt rather than saw the slight shift in his posture. The same one she'd seen in the field when the people around him were starting to understand what he already knew. The man in the suit nodded once, professional, and stepped away to make a call. The state officer held her gaze a half-second longer than necessary before following. She turned to Cross. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized from 8 years ago, from a specific afternoon in a specific context she never talked about. The look of a man who had already done the math on a situation and arrived at a conclusion he was allowing her to reach herself. You know what they're going to find, she said. It wasn't a question. I know what's in your record, he said. Marsh doesn't. No, Cross said. He doesn't. She turned and looked down the corridor toward the ER proper, toward Donnelly's building, toward the station where Marsh had stood with his thumbs in his belt and his 6 years of unquestioned access, toward the ER where Marcus Webb was sleeping off a fever with an IV in his arm and a dressing on his hand that nobody had bothered with before tonight. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the way she'd felt after long operations, wrung out, clear-headed, aware that what came next was going to be harder in some ways than what had already happened. The work wasn't done. It was rarely done when it felt like it should be. But something had shifted. She could feel it in the building the way you feel a change in pressure. Subtle, structural, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself but is already in motion by the time you notice it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. No name, just a message, 3 words and a file attachment. You should see this. She opened the attachment. It took her 3 seconds to understand what she was looking at, then 2 more to understand the implications. She stood in the corridor outside the service entrance, in the harsh light of a Dellwood hospital at 3 a.m., and looked at the footage on her phone screen. Security footage, time-stamped, interior angle, clearly taken from a camera positioned above the nurse's station, and watched Derek Marsh do something that no 6-year relationship with administration was going to be able to explain away. Her face didn't change, but her grip on the phone tightened. The footage was 47 seconds long. No audio. The angle was high and slightly off-center, the way hospital security cameras almost always are, positioned for coverage, not clarity, so the image had the grainy, slightly compressed quality of a system that recorded everything and was reviewed by almost no one. But the resolution was good enough. More than good enough. The timestamp in the lower right corner read 22:14:08, just over an hour before the Route 9 casualties had started arriving, before the military convoy, before Donnelly's visit to Nora's floor. She watched it twice. In the footage, Derek Marsh was standing at the nurse's station. The corridor behind him was quiet. Low sensus between rushes, the specific stillness of an ER in a brief lull. He was alone at the station. Or almost alone. There was a figure at the far left edge of the frame, a nurse's back moving away. Marsh reached across the station counter and picked up a folder. He looked at it briefly. Then he reached into his breast pocket and took out his phone, photographed 2 pages without removing them from the folder, put the phone away, and put the folder back exactly where it had been. The folder had Marcus Webb's name on the tab. She stood in the corridor and thought about what she'd just seen. Not the act itself, which was clear enough, but the shape of it. What it meant that he'd done it. What it meant that someone had sent her this. What it meant that there was a camera angle that caught it, that the footage existed, that it had left whatever server it lived on and arrived on her phone from an unknown number at 3 a.m. Someone inside this hospital had sent it to her. That person knew her number. She looked at the file's metadata. There wasn't much. The attachment had come through a messaging app she didn't use often, sent from an account with no profile information. But the footage itself had a file name, station_cam4_221.mp4. Internal naming convention, someone with access to the camera system. She forwarded the file to 3 places, her own email, Cross's number, and the contact information the man in the suit had given her, the Regional Emergency Management Office. Then she pocketed her phone and went back inside. The man in the suit, whose name she'd learned was Elliot Farrow, was still at the service entrance when she returned. He was wrapping up a call, tablet tucked under his arm, the state officer waiting at a respectful distance. She walked up to him and said, without preamble, "Check your email." He looked at her. "Right now?" Within the next few minutes would be useful. He read her face, pulled out his tablet, and checked. She watched him watch the footage. He watched it twice, same as she had. The state officer watched it once over his shoulder. Nobody said anything for a moment. "Where did you get this?" Farrow said. "Unknown sender, 20 minutes ago." "Do you know what he was photographing?" Marcus Webb's intake folder, the patient I admitted against Officer Marsh's recommendation earlier in the evening. Farrow was quiet. Then, that patient's file would contain his medical history, address information if any, service records from intake. Yes, Marsh was photographing a patient's private medical record. That's what it looks like. Farrow lowered the tablet. He and the state officer exchanged a look. Not long, not dramatic, just the specific glance of 2 people who have both arrived at the same calculation and are checking that they've landed in the same place. "We're going to need to establish chain of custody on this footage," Farrow said. "Who has access to that camera system?" "Hospital security, IT, possibly administration." She paused. "If you're asking who might have sent it, I don't know. But whoever it was, they have access to the system and they have my number." "A staff member?" "Almost certainly." Farrow nodded slowly. Sit tight, he said, which was not an instruction she intended to follow literally, but which she understood to mean we're moving. She went back to her patients. It was 3:40 a.m. when Marsh came back to the ER. She heard him before she saw him, not his voice this time, but the shift in the room again, that same collective tightening, the particular silence that people make when someone they're afraid of enters a space. She was at bed 6, charting, and she looked up and watched him come through the main corridor with his jaw set and his stride carrying the specific energy of a person who has been told something and is operating on the anger of that information rather than its content. He saw her, came straight toward her. She didn't move from the charting station. "Who sent it?" he said. Not loud. The voice he'd used on her earlier in the night, the pressurized one, contained, meant to land without witnesses being able to point to it as a threat. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. "Don't." He stopped 3 feet away. His face was doing something complex. Anger on top, and under it something that she recognized as the specific fear of a person who has been powerful for a long time and is starting to feel that power develop a crack. The footage. From Station 4. Someone pulled it and sent it out. That's a HIPAA violation. That's accessing a patient's private medical records without authorization is a HIPAA violation, she said. Sending security footage documenting a potential crime to an ongoing investigation is generally not. His face went very still. "You need to be careful," he said. "I'm always careful. I have been in this hospital for 6 years, and I have relationships here that you—" He stopped. "Reset. Whatever you think is happening, you should think very carefully about where you put yourself in it." She looked at him with the flat, complete attention that she'd learned in environments where reading a person's actual intent, past their words, past their volume, past their surface presentation, was a survival skill. She read him now. He was afraid. Not of her specifically, of the footage, of whatever else existed that he hadn't known about until tonight. "Derek," the voice came from behind him. Farrow standing at the entrance to the corridor, tablet in hand, the state officer beside him. "We need you to come with us." Marsh turned slowly. "This is a formal request," Farrow said. His voice had the careful, deliberate quality of someone establishing a record. "We have questions regarding events at this facility. We'd like to conduct that conversation now." The room was not full. It was 3 a.m., census was low, the overnight staff were managing their remaining patients. But the people who were there had gone still. A floor nurse near the medication station. 2 aides near Bay 3. Sandra, who had come back in after going home briefly, standing at the edge of the station with a chart in her hand and an expression that had stopped pretending to be neutral. Marsh looked back at Nora once. She held his gaze without expression. Then he turned and walked toward Farrow with his head up, because whatever else Derek Marsh was, he was not the kind of man who let himself be seen to flinch. She watched him go. Then she went back to her chart. At 4:15 a.m., Dr. Garrett found her in the break room. He looked like a man who'd been awake for 20 hours and had stopped pretending to be fine about it sometime around hour 16. He sat across from her with no coffee, no tablet, nothing in his hands, just his elbows on the table and the expression of someone who had a specific conversation to have and was deciding how to start it. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "For what, specifically?" "For not saying anything when Donnelly pulled you off the floor earlier." He met her eyes. "I knew it was wrong. I didn't push back. You had your own position to protect." "That's exactly the problem." He exhaled. "I've been protecting my position in this hospital for 11 years. I've watched Marsh come through here and do things that I wrote notes about and filed away and never escalated, because escalating meant a conversation with Donnelly that I knew would go nowhere." He paused. "And then you walked in here 3 months ago and you talked back to him like it was nothing, like it was the most obvious thing in the world." "It wasn't nothing," she said. "I just decided it was worth the cost." "What made you decide that?" She thought about Marcus Webb's fractured fingers, the infection tracking up toward his wrist, the way he'd looked at the floor while Marsh talked about him like he wasn't in the room. "He needed the antibiotics," she said. Garrett was quiet for a moment. The military unit's report, he said. Cross told me it's going to document everything from the moment they arrived, including Marsh's conduct during an active mass casualty response. He paused. That's a federal document. It goes to a completely different chain than hospital administration. I know. Donnelly can't touch it. I know that too. He looked at her across the table. The break room was very quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a monitor alarm that was immediately silenced. Who are you? He asked. Not unkindly, just honestly. The question of a person who'd been watching a colleague and had run out of the framework he'd started with. A nurse, she said. Before that. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. Before that, I was somewhere else doing something harder. She stood. I should get back to the floor. He didn't stop her. But as she reached the door, he said, For what it's worth, what you did tonight, the splenic lac, the pneumothorax, the blood allocation call. He shook his head slightly. I've worked with attendings who wouldn't have caught all three. She paused in the doorway. Get some sleep when the shift ends, she said. You look terrible. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Betrayed. Dawn came the way it always did in hospitals. Not as a moment, but as a gradual brightening of the windows that the interior fluorescence made almost irrelevant. The day shift started filtering in at 6 a.m., carrying coffee cups and the specific energy of people who'd slept and couldn't quite read the room they were walking into. Sandra did the handoff briefing. Nora listened from the edge of the station, updating her final charts, catching the looks that the incoming staff gave to the military personnel who were still present. Cross's team was completing their own documentation. The 3 military patients from the convoy were being assessed for morning discharge or transfer. And to the 2 plainclothes individuals from the state office who were moving through the administrative wing with the quiet, purposeful energy of people who had already found what they were looking for and were now gathering it carefully. She finished her last chart at 6:27 a.m., 13 hours after she'd arrived. She was pulling on her jacket at her locker when Sandra came in. They found 3 more, Sandra said. Nora looked at her. Staff members who'd filed internal complaints about Marsh, going back 4 years. Sandra's voice was careful, like she was still processing. They were filed with Donnelly's office. None of them were escalated. None of them were acknowledged. She paused. One of them was the aide from last night, the kid who was with Marcus Webb when Marsh came in. He filed a complaint 8 months ago after Marsh roughed up a patient in the corridor. She stopped. Donnelly buried it. Nora stood with her jacket in her hand. Donnelly knew, she said. Not a question. He had to have. The complaints went directly to his office. Sandra looked at the floor briefly. They're pulling his email records now. The state office requested them an hour ago. The scope of it settled over the room. Not dramatically, just with the weight of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being seen clearly. The aide, Nora said. Is he okay? Scared, but he talked to them. He talked for almost an hour. Sandra looked up. He said, when they asked him why he'd never said anything after the complaint went nowhere, he said he didn't think anyone was listening. She thought about that for a moment. Then she finished putting her jacket on. They're listening now, she said. She was 20 feet from the exit when Farrow found her. He looked like a man who'd been up all night running toward something and had now arrived and was standing still for the first time. He had his tablet under his arm and a folder that hadn't been there before, and his expression had shifted from the careful professional neutrality of their earlier conversations to something more direct. Ms. Vasquez, do you have a few minutes? I was about to go home. I understand. This won't take long. He glanced toward a seating area near the lobby, empty at this hour, neutral ground. Please. She followed him. They sat. He put the folder on the low table between them, but didn't open it. We've been in contact with DoD records regarding your service history, he said. We did that partly to address the complaint Marsh filed, the one alleging that you misrepresented your credentials. And his complaint has no basis. He said it plainly, without ceremony. Your nursing license is valid and properly obtained. Your employment application at Harlow General is accurate and complete. He paused. What your application doesn't contain, because you weren't required to disclose it, is your prior service record. She was still. You were a combat trauma medic for 8 years, Farrow said, deployed to 3 active theaters. You were promoted to the senior medical NCO role in your unit at 26, which is, I'm told, unusually fast. You received a commendation for actions during a mass casualty event in the field. He looked at her. 2 commendations, actually. I know what I did, she said. I know you do. He opened the folder. I'm telling you because when Marsh filed his complaint, he expected to find something, some gap, some irregularity, something he could use. Instead, we found a service record that, to put it plainly, makes his characterization of you as a problematic employee look like what it actually is. He turned the folder to face her. We're going to need you to sign a release allowing us to reference the relevant portions of your record in the formal investigation documentation. She looked at the paper. 8 years. She'd spent 8 years doing work she didn't talk about, in places she didn't describe, that had left marks she'd spent the years since learning to carry quietly. She hadn't come to Harlow General to be seen. She'd come because Delwood had an opening and because her apartment on Keller Street had been available and because she'd needed somewhere to land after a period she didn't examine too closely. She hadn't come to be known, but Marcus Webb's hand had been infected and Marsh had been in the corridor, and some things were more important than staying quiet. She picked up the pen, signed. Farrow took the paper back, squared it against the folder, and then looked at her with something that was as close to personal as he'd gotten all night. Officer Marsh is being placed on administrative suspension pending the outcome of the investigation. That happened about 40 minutes ago. He paused. Mr. Donnelly has been asked to step back from operational duties while his office's handling of the prior complaints is reviewed. She nodded once. There's going to be a formal process, Farrow said. It's going to take time, weeks, probably more. But what happened here tonight, the footage, the complaints, the incident documentation, it's enough to build on. I know how investigations work, she said. I imagine you do. She stood. He stood with her, extended his hand. She shook it. Firm, brief, the handshake of 2 people who'd done something that needed doing and were both tired and weren't going to be dramatic about it. She walked toward the exit. The parking structure was cold at 6:45 a.m. The rain had stopped sometime around 4 and the concrete was still wet, the puddles on the asphalt reflecting the early gray light in long, wavering strips. She found her car on the 2nd level, unlocked it, and sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel for a moment. She didn't count. She just sat. Through the open concrete siding of the structure, she could see the hospital's east entrance, the service doors that the military convoy had come through. Cross's vehicles were still there, 2 of them, with a military transport that had arrived sometime after 5 a.m. to assist with the patient transfers. She could see movement near the doors, figures in tactical gear loading equipment cases, the systematic end-of-operation breakdown of a field medical team packing out. Her phone buzzed. Cross. She answered. You heading out? He said. About to. My CO wants to include a commendation in the after-action report for your conduct during the MCE response. A pause. Citing specific actions, the pneumothorax catch, the splenic lac call, the blood allocation. Tell him I was doing my job. I did. He said that's why it's a commendation and not just a mention. Another pause, shorter. You okay? She looked through the windshield at the hospital's concrete face, at the lit windows of the ER on the ground floor, at the parking lot, still and wet in the early morning. I'm tired, she said. I'm going home. Get some sleep. You too. She paused. Cross? Yeah. The footage. The person who sent it to me. Do you know who it was? Silence for a moment. Why? Because whoever it was took a real risk. I'd like to... I don't know. I'd like to know. Another silence. Then, I don't know, but I have a guess. He paused. The aide. The kid who filed the complaint 8 months ago. She thought about that. About an aide who'd been told essentially that his complaint didn't matter. Who'd pulled security footage in the middle of a mass casualty night shift and sent it to a nurse he barely knew because he'd watched what she'd done and made a bet. "Okay," she said. "Go home, Vasquez." She started the car. She was pulling out of the space when her phone buzzed again. Different number this time. She glanced at the screen at the next stop. It was a text from Sandra. 4 words. "Turn on the news." She pulled out of the parking structure and turned left onto the access road that ran alongside the hospital's main building. And at the junction where the access road met the main street, she stopped for the light and looked through the passenger window at the hospital's front entrance. There were 2 news vans on the street. Cameras out. A reporter she didn't recognize standing with a microphone on the sidewalk, talking into the lens. She looked long enough to read the chyron on the monitor one of the crew members was holding. Harlow. General officer suspended amid investigation. Sources say evidence extends years. The light turned green. She drove. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her face was neutral. She was 31 years old, and she'd spent the last 13 hours doing what she'd been trained to do, in the place she'd been trained to do it, and now she was going home to her apartment on Keller Street and her secondhand coffee maker and the quiet she'd built around herself like a structure. She almost made it. She was 3 blocks from her building when her phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. Then a second call, same number, then a third. She pulled over, answered. "Ms. Vasquez?" The voice was female, professional. The register of someone who was used to having calls returned rather than answered directly. "My name is Karen Tull. I'm the regional director for the State Health Services Investigation Unit. I apologize for the early hour." "It's fine," Nora said. "I'll be direct. In the course of the review that's been initiated this morning, my team has uncovered something that goes beyond what was initially reported." A brief pause. "The footage from Station 4, the footage you forwarded to Mr. Farrow, we've been reviewing the full camera archive from the past 8 months." Nora was very still. Officer Marsh appears in the archive on 43 separate occasions. In 31 of those appearances, he accessed areas of the facility that are outside his stated role. On 17 occasions, there's documented evidence of what appears to be patient record access or interference with clinical documentation. The director paused again. "But that isn't the reason I'm calling." "What's the reason?" "On 4 of those occasions," the director said, her voice dropping to a register that said, "This is the part that changes everything," Marsh is seen with a second individual, an employee of this hospital. And what they appear to be doing, Ms. Vasquez, is not incidental. It looks systematic. It looks coordinated. She paused. "We've identified the second individual, but we haven't yet been able to locate them." A beat of silence on the line. "We think you may know who this person is," the director said, "because the footage from the most recent recording, from 2 weeks ago, shows this individual handing documents to Marsh near the service entrance." Another pause, and this one had a different weight. "The documents appear to be personnel files, specifically the personnel files of new hires." A final pause. "Including yours." The street outside was quiet. A car passed. A pigeon landed on the sidewalk across from her and immediately left. "Who is it?" Nora said. The director said a name, and Nora closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Because the name was someone who had access to her personnel file, her number, her employment history, and who had just hours ago sat across from her in the break room with a careful expression and said things that had sounded like honesty. The name was Dr. Amos Garrett. She sat with the name for a long moment. Not because she doubted it. The doubt lasted approximately 4 seconds, the time it took for the pieces to arrange themselves into a pattern she should have recognized sooner. The apology in the break room, the careful framing of it. I should have said something. The way he'd looked at her when he asked, "Who are you?" Not the curiosity of a colleague, something more specific. The look of a person checking whether a conclusion they'd already reached was visible on their face. The look of someone who already knew the answer. "Ms. Vasquez," the director said, "are you still there?" "I'm here." She kept her voice level. 11 years. Garrett had said 11 years in this hospital. 11 years during which the complaints went nowhere, and the footage accumulated, and the arrangement between Marsh and someone inside the building had apparently been running long enough to become invisible. You said you haven't been able to locate him yet. He left the hospital approximately 40 minutes ago. His vehicle is gone from the staff lot. He knew, Nora said. When the investigation team arrived, he knew what the footage would eventually show. That's our assessment, yes. She looked at the street outside, 3 blocks from her building, 7 hours into a shift that had started as a routine overnight and had become something she didn't have a clean word for. I need you to tell me, she said, whether the documents he passed to Marsh, my personnel file, were used for anything actionable, anything that could compromise the investigation. We're still establishing that. The director paused. But I want to be transparent with you. It's possible that some of what Marsh knew about you, including information he may have planned to use in his counter-complaint, came from Garrett. From inside. She absorbed this without reacting visibly, which was possible because she was alone in her car. Okay, she said. We're going to need you to come in. Not today. You've been on shift all night, and that's on record. But tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. A pause. You're not a subject of this investigation, Ms. Vasquez. I want to be clear about that. But you are material to it in ways that are going to be important. I'll be there, she said. She ended the call. She sat for another 30 seconds. Then she drove the 3 blocks to her building, parked in the lot, walked up the stairs to her apartment, and stood in her kitchen for a moment looking at the second-hand coffee maker. She made coffee. She didn't sleep. By 9 a.m., she was back at her kitchen table with her laptop open, a second cup cooling beside her, working through the thing the way she'd been trained to work through problems. Not emotionally, not reactively, but systematically, from the edges in. Garrett had been the attending physician for 11 years. He had access to HR systems through the attending physician portal, standard in most hospital networks, giving doctors visibility into the staff they supervised, personnel files, shift histories, employment applications. He'd known who she was before she knew she was going to matter. She thought about the specific sequence, the night she'd first pushed back on Marsh at the nurses' station, the first real documented confrontation. That had been 2 weeks ago. The footage the director had referenced, the most recent recording, was also from 2 weeks ago. Garrett handing documents near the service entrance. Her personnel file. He'd passed her file to Marsh the same night she'd created a problem. She sat with that and felt the particular kind of anger that doesn't come out as noise, the kind that settles into the chest and becomes very cold and very clear. She'd been suspicious of Marsh. She'd been watching the right wall and the door had been somewhere else entirely. It happened. You missed things. The lesson wasn't to feel stupid about it. The lesson was to not miss the next thing. She picked up her phone and called Cross. He answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't slept either. Vasquez. Garrett, she said. A pause. Yeah. You knew? I suspected. Around 4 a.m. His voice had the flat, carefully calibrated quality of someone who has been running on no sleep and is rationing their cognitive load. The way he talked about you in the break room, I caught it late. There was something off about the framing. Too careful. Why didn't you say anything? Because I wasn't sure, and because the investigation team was already pulling the archive. I figured it would surface faster through them than through me making an accusation I couldn't back up. A brief pause. Was I wrong? She thought about it. No, she said. It surfaced. The director called you. An hour ago. They picked him up, Cross said. 20 minutes ago, about 40 miles outside Delwood. He'd taken the interstate east. They flagged his plates. He paused. He had a laptop bag with him. They're going through it now. She set down her coffee cup. What was on it? She said. That's still being established, but preliminary. It looks like he'd been keeping records, his own records, of the arrangement. Another pause. Which is either very stupid or insurance, she said. Yeah, my read too. He was keeping documentation on Marsh in case Marsh ever tried to cut him out or point at him. Cross was quiet for a moment. The problem with that strategy is that the documentation proves the arrangement existed, which means he's not just a witness, she said. No, he's a participant. She stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. The street below was ordinary. A woman walking a dog, a delivery vehicle idling at the corner, the gray morning light of early June sitting flat and undramatic on the rooftops. "What does his documentation show?" she said. "I don't have full details, but the director mentioned patient data, repeated instances, going back further than 8 months. His voice was careful. Nora." She noted the first name. In 8 years of working alongside Cross in contexts where first names were sometimes not used for months, the shift to first name was a specific signal. "How far back?" she said. "They think possibly 3 years." The window was cold under her hand. 3 years, which meant the arrangement predated her by almost 2 years, predated whatever specific threat she'd represented or whatever file Garrett had pulled and handed over. She'd walked into something that was already running, something established and practiced and supported by enough layers of administrative complicity. Donnelly's buried complaints, Marsh's institutional access, Garrett's medical authority and database reach, that it had become essentially self-sustaining. "What were they doing with the patient data?" she said. "That's what they're still working out." He paused. "But there are flags in the records, specific patients, unhoused individuals mostly, people who came through the ER without family contacts, without advocates, without anyone who'd follow up if their care documentation was altered." She closed her eyes for a moment. Not altered to harm them directly. She understood immediately what the shape of it was, even without the details. She'd seen the shape before, in different contexts, with different mechanisms. Altered to manipulate billing, to reclassify care, to create paperwork that directed resources in ways that benefited the people controlling the paperwork. Marcus Webb's file sitting on the station counter, Marsh photographing it, Garrett with access to the database. "Billing fraud," she said. "That appears to be part of it," Cross said. "Possibly the larger part." She stood at the window for another moment. Then she said, "Cross, the aide, the one you thought might have sent me the footage." "Yeah." "His name is, I need to find out his name. Darius Holm. He's been on the night shift for 18 months. She wrote it down on the notepad she kept by her kitchen window. An old habit. She wrote things on paper when they mattered, because paper didn't get accidentally deleted. "He's going to need someone in his corner when the dust settles," she said. "He's an 18-month employee who pulled security footage and submitted it to an active investigation. Administration might try to call that unauthorized access." "Administration might be too busy with their own problems to make that argument," Cross said. "Might be, but make sure his union rep knows what he did and why. Formally." "Already done," Cross said. "I called his local rep at 7 this morning." She exhaled. "Get some sleep," Cross said. "I will," she said, and knew she probably wouldn't. Not. She didn't sleep. She showered, changed, ate something she didn't taste, and sat with her laptop for another 2 hours going through the documents the state office had emailed her. A formal acknowledgement of her cooperation, a preliminary outline of her role as a witness, a list of what they'd need from her at the morning meeting. At noon, her phone rang. Sandra. "Donnelly resigned," Sandra said. No preamble, no soft landing, just the words. "About an hour ago. He submitted a letter to the board. He's citing personal reasons." "Of course he is," Nora said. "The board has appointed an interim director while they conduct their own review." Sandra's voice had a quality she'd rarely heard from her. Something lighter, not quite relief, but the specific absence of a weight that had been there so long it had become part of the room's furniture. "It's Dr. Priya Mehta. She's been on the surgical side for 8 years. Sandra paused. "She's called a mandatory staff meeting for Thursday. The whole department." "Good." "Nora, Marsh was officially charged this morning." Sandra's voice dropped. "Criminal charges, evidence tampering, abuse of authority, and..." A brief pause. 3 counts relating to patient record access. They're saying there may be more once they finish the archive review." She looked at the notepad on her kitchen table. Darius Holmes' name in her handwriting, the coffee cup beside it. "What about Garrett?" Sandra said. "That's still moving." Sandra stopped, started again. "I worked with him for 9 years. I thought I knew how he..." She stopped again. The sentence didn't have an ending that worked. "People show you what they need you to see," Nora said. It wasn't consolation. It was just true. You didn't miss something obvious. He was careful. It doesn't make me feel better. It's not supposed to. It's just accurate. She paused. How are the patients? The Route 9 intakes? The shift in topic was deliberate, and Sandra recognized it. Nora heard it in the brief silence before she responded. 2 discharged this morning, 4 still inpatient but stable. The woman from the splenic lac. She's out of recovery, and her family was there when she woke up. Another pause. Her daughter brought flowers, left them at the nurse's station. The card said for the team. Good, Nora said. Marcus Webb is being transferred to a long-term care facility this afternoon. His infection's responding well. Social services connected him with a veteran support coordinator. She thought about the way he'd looked at her in the dark at 2 a.m., barely awake, asking why. The word she'd given him, you needed the antibiotic timing managed correctly, which was true, but wasn't the whole answer. The whole answer was more complicated and less clean, and she wasn't going to try to package it into something that sounded like a lesson. Okay, she said. Are you coming in tomorrow? Sandra asked. I have a meeting with the state office at 10. After that, yes. The staff, Sandra paused. There's been talk about you, about what you did last night. Not gossip. I mean, there's gossip, but there's also... People are saying things. Darius talked to 3 people before he went home this morning. Another pause. Some people are saying they didn't know what was going on. Some people are saying they did know and didn't say anything. A lot of people are saying both at once. Nora understood that. The complicated discomfort of realizing you'd been present for something and had made yourself small inside it. It's going to be uncomfortable for a while, she said. Longer than a while, I think. Probably. She paused. Sandra, what you said this morning about not saying something when Donnelly pulled me off the floor, I meant what I said. You made the calculations you had to make. I know you meant it. Sandra was quiet. I'm not sure I agree with you, though. That surprised her slightly. She didn't say anything. I think I told myself I was being practical, Sandra continued, and I think practical was another word for something I don't want to use. A beat. I'm going to try to remember tonight, not as an achievement, as a reminder. The call ended with the specific quality of conversations that have said what they needed to say and don't need a formal close. Nora put her phone down and looked at the wall of her apartment. The meeting the next morning was in a building on the north side of Dellwood, a state offices complex, the kind of architecture that communicates bureaucratic permanence through sheer beige volume. Director Toll's office was on the 4th floor, clean desk, 2 chairs across from it, a window overlooking a parking structure. Toll was smaller than her voice on the phone had suggested, mid-50s, efficient posture, reading glasses that she took off when Nora sat down. Farrow was there. The state officer from the previous night, whose name turned out to be Lieutenant Corey Brandt, was in a chair to the right. They went through it methodically. Not interrogation. It never felt like interrogation. It felt like assembly, like they were building something and needed her section of the architecture placed accurately before they could add what came next. She walked through the night chronologically. Marcus Webb and the corridor, the nurse's station confrontation, Donnelly's office, the mass casualty event, Marsh in the ER at 3:40 a.m., the footage, the forwarding, the service entrance conversation. She was precise. She corrected herself once, got a timestamp wrong by 15 minutes, and went back and fixed it, and noted twice when she was giving observation rather than fact. Toll was the same way. Questions that trimmed rather than expanded. A methodology Nora recognized from environments where imprecision created real consequences. They were an hour in when Farrow set a photograph on the table between them. Do you recognize this? He said. It was a printout from the security archive, slightly blurry, the camera angle from above and behind. 2 people at the service entrance, at night. The posture of the taller one was unmistakably Garrett. The documents visible in the frame were in a manila folder, the edge of a tab readable if you knew how to look at compressed footage. Personnel. Recent hire. She looked at it for a moment. Yes. Is there anything in Dr. Garrett's conduct toward you during your 3 months at Harlow General, prior to last night, that in retrospect reads differently? Tull asked. She thought about that carefully. He was consistently positioned as a reasonable moderate, she said. He didn't support Marsh openly, but he didn't push back either. Every time there was a confrontation, he appeared to smooth things over. She paused. I read that as conflict avoidance. It was actually positioning, keeping the temperature low enough that the arrangement didn't draw scrutiny. And last night, in the break room? He apologized, she said. It was constructed well. It sounded like accountability. She kept her voice even. I think he was trying to read how much I knew and reassure himself that I was attributing his conduct to ordinary institutional cowardice rather than something organized. Tull wrote something. Did it work? For about 6 hours, Nora said. Farrow almost smiled, didn't quite get there. His laptop, Brant said, picking up the thread. The documents he'd retained. We've had analysts working since yesterday morning. What we're finding is, it's extensive. He paused. He kept records of every patient data access he made on Marsh's behalf, every file pulled, every record modified. Dates, what was changed, what was passed. Another pause. We believe he was keeping it because he was afraid of Marsh. He wanted leverage. What he actually created was a complete log of his own participation. How many patients? Nora said. In terms of records touched, over 60. In terms of records materially altered in ways that affected billing or care documentation, we're currently at 31 confirmed. The range goes back 38 months. She looked at the table. 31 people, mostly people without advocates. People who'd come into the ER sick or hurt or in crisis and had moved through a system that was supposed to be neutral and had not been neutral. It had been quietly, systematically used against them. Their data harvested, their records adjusted, their vulnerability exploited by a doctor who wore competence like a coat, and an officer who used institutional access like a tool. And it had been running for 38 months before a homeless veteran came in with infected fingers, and a nurse who couldn't leave well enough alone had pushed back in a corridor. She was not going to feel like a hero about that. She was going to feel the weight of the 30 months that had preceded her. What happens to the affected patients? She said. We're working with advocacy groups to identify each individual and review their cases, Tull said. Some will require medical record correction. Some may have grounds for civil action. The billing fraud component is going to federal partners. That carries its own consequences for the hospital and potentially for individual practitioners who were involved. Garrett? Yes. Tull met her eyes. He's been charged. 6 counts initially, with the expectation of more to follow. He's been suspended from medical practice pending the investigation. His state license is under emergency review. 11 years. Nora thought about it. The specific gravity of 11 years spent building a career and a reputation inside an institution. Using that reputation as cover for something that had been slowly, quietly, eating at everything around it. She didn't feel satisfaction at the image of it collapsing. She felt a particular kind of tiredness. Is there anything else you need from me today? She said. One thing, Tull said. She exchanged a brief look with Farrow. There's a request from the State Health Services Board. They're conducting a parallel review of Harlow General's operations and governance. They want to speak with you, not as a witness, but in an advisory capacity. She paused. They're specifically interested in your perspective on the clinical culture that allowed this to operate for 3 years without internal escalation. Nora looked at her. You have a background, Tull said carefully, that gives you a specific vantage point. You've worked in environments where hierarchy and authority function very differently, where accountability structures are more immediate. Another pause. The board wants to know how a hospital gets from here to something that doesn't allow this again. They think your experience is relevant. She sat with that for a moment. The request had a particular shape. It was asking her to be useful in a way that was more public than she'd operated in years, more permanent, the kind of involvement that left a record. Let me think about it, she said. Tull nodded, apparently unsurprised. Of course. Take a few days. She was in the elevator going down when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, different from the one that had sent the footage. She answered anyway. Miss Vasquez? Male voice. Older. The particular register of someone who is accustomed to being the one who initiates contact and does not apologize for it. My name is Bernard Holt. I'm the lead attorney for Derek Marsh. She stopped the elevator with her hand. Let the doors close. Mr. Holt, she said, I'll be direct. My client is prepared to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for consideration of his charges. As part of that cooperation, he wants to provide testimony regarding the full scope of the arrangement at Harlow General. A pause. His testimony will implicate additional parties, individuals whose involvement has not yet been identified by the investigation. That's a conversation he should be having with the state office, she said. He will. He is. Another pause, more deliberate. The reason I'm calling you specifically is that my client's testimony, the portion that's currently being negotiated, includes information directly relevant to you, to why you were targeted. She was still. My client didn't select you randomly, Holt said. He was given a specific directive to find cause to remove you from Harlow General. That directive came from a source that Dr. Garrett was not aware of. A pause. Garrett provided your file to Marsh, but someone else told Marsh why your file mattered. Someone who knew your service history before Marsh did. The elevator hummed around her. Who? She said. That's what my client's testimony will establish, Holt said. I'm calling you because his cooperation agreement is still being negotiated, and there is a window, a short one, before that testimony becomes part of the formal record and the individual in question becomes aware that they've been named. He paused. My client wanted you to know that the person who put your name on a list is not a police officer, not a hospital administrator. She looked at the elevator's floor indicator, stuck between 3 and 2. Then who? She said. Someone, Holt said carefully, who served. Same theater as you, different unit. Someone who had reason to believe that a decorated combat medic turned civilian nurse in Delwood, Missouri, was someone they could not afford to have working in a hospital with this kind of patient population. Another pause. Someone who knew exactly what you would do if you saw the wrong thing, because they'd seen you do it before. The elevator began to move again. She said nothing. Ms. Vasquez, Holt said, my client isn't a good person. He's made that clear in his own conduct, but he is, at this point, a frightened one, and frightened people tell the truth when the math works out that way. A final pause. The name will be in the formal record within 48 hours. I thought you deserved to hear it before then. Tell me, she said. Holt said the name. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto the building's lobby. Beige tile, fluorescent light, a security desk with a guard who was eating a sandwich and reading something on his phone. She walked out into the ordinary morning. The name was already working through everything she remembered, but 8 years of operations, faces and units and situations, finding the place where it fit. And it did fit. It fit in a way that was going to require sitting somewhere quiet and thinking through the implications carefully, because if what Holt was suggesting was accurate, then what had happened at Harlow General wasn't opportunistic. It wasn't a local arrangement that had grown large enough to become visible. It was targeted. From the beginning, she pushed through the building's main doors into the June air and stood on the sidewalk outside the state offices on the north side of Delwood and looked at the street in front of her. Ordinary traffic, ordinary morning, the city going about its business at 11:30 a.m. with no visible relationship to what had just been said in an elevator. Her phone was still in her hand. She opened her contacts, found Cross, started to dial, and then stopped, because there was a car parked across the street that hadn't been there when she'd arrived. A dark sedan, civilian plates, and behind the wheel a face she hadn't seen in 4 years. A face she recognized from a specific geography, a specific year, a specific series of decisions she had made and had been trying to quietly live with ever since. The face was looking at her, and it wasn't afraid. She didn't move. That was the first decision, to not move, to not cross the street, to not make any gesture that suggested she was surprised or rattled, or that the face behind the windshield had landed with the impact it had. She stood on the sidewalk outside the state offices and looked at the car with the same flat attention she'd used on Marsh in the corridor, the same stillness she'd used on Donnelly in his carpeted office, The specific quality of not reacting that she'd first developed in places where reacting wrong had costs she didn't want to think about on a Tuesday morning in Missouri. The face behind the windshield was Colonel Warren Spade, retired. She knew that because she'd heard it through channels, the kind of informal network that former service members maintain without ever formally maintaining it. The word-of-mouth geography of who was where and doing what that moves faster than any official communication. She'd heard Spade had retired 2 years ago. She hadn't thought about where he'd landed. She hadn't asked. She was asking now, internally, with the specific clarity of someone assembling a picture that had been lying in pieces across the floor for the last 18 hours. Spade was in his early 60s. She'd known him at 44. Compact, deliberate, with the kind of authority that didn't require volume because it had been constructed over years into something self-sustaining. He'd been the senior officer in her theater during her 3rd deployment, not her direct commanding officer. Above that, the kind of presence that shaped operations without appearing in their details. They had disagreed. That was the clean word for it. The full word involved a situation she had documented and reported and watched be classified and buried, a situation involving the handling of civilian casualties in a specific engagement that Spade had characterized one way and that Nora had characterized differently, and that had ended with her transfer to a different unit, and a commendation that she understood at the time to be a mechanism for keeping her quiet by giving her something she couldn't publicly reject. She had never spoken about it outside of the formal report. She had taken the commendation. She had transferred. She had eventually left the service and moved to Dellwood, Missouri, and taken a job at Harlow General because the city had an opening and her apartment had been available and she'd needed somewhere to land. She had not been hiding, but she had been quiet. Spade had found quiet and decided it meant she'd been neutralized. He was wrong. She walked to the car. She went to the passenger side, tried the handle. Unlocked. She got in, which was itself a decision. Getting in meant a private conversation, meant information she couldn't gather from a distance, meant being in a space he controlled. She made the decision anyway because the alternative was to call Cross and wait and let whatever Spade had come to do get done at a time and angle of his choosing. She'd always preferred to know. The interior of the car smelled like rental, that specific industrial neutral of a vehicle that had been cleaned with something approximate. Spade was in a civilian jacket, no insignia, gray at the temples in a way that had become more pronounced than she remembered. He was looking forward through the windshield. "Nora?" he said. "Colonel?" "I'm retired." "I know." She looked at the building across the street, the state offices, the beige concrete. "What are you doing in Dellwood?" "I came to talk to you." "You could have called." "I didn't have your number." He paused. "Until recently." She let that sit for exactly the time it needed to sit. "Garrett," she said. "I've known Amos Garrett for 9 years. We served adjacent to each other for 8 months during my last tour. He was a flight surgeon." He paused. "We stayed in contact. And when I showed up at his hospital, he recognized your name from the transfer records." Spade's voice was flat, not emotionless. She'd known him well enough to hear the control in it, the deliberate management of register. "He contacted me. And you told him I was a problem." He was quiet. "Spade." She turned to look at him directly. Marsh was running a billing fraud operation. He was accessing patient records, altering documentation, operating with impunity inside that hospital for 3 years because Donnelly covered for him and Garrett fed him information. 31 confirmed patients with material record alterations, most of them without advocates. She paused. "I walked into that. I didn't go looking for it." "I know." "Then what exactly were you trying to prevent?" He turned to look at her then, and she saw something she hadn't expected to see in a face she'd associated for 4 years with institutional intractability. Not remorse exactly, something more provisional than that. Something that looked like a person encountering the gap between the version of events they'd been carrying and the version that had just been laid out in front of them. "The report you filed," he said. "The one about the Kadir engagement." She waited. "I didn't bury it to protect myself," he said. "That's not what I reported," she said. "I reported what I saw. I reported my medical assessment of the casualties and the sequence of events. I didn't make characterizations about intent. I know what you reported. Then you know I didn't accuse you of anything. You documented something that, in the wrong hands, could have been used to... Stopped. His jaw moved. It was a complicated situation. The optics of that engagement. 3 civilian casualties, she said. One of them was 12 years old. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I documented what I saw clinically, the nature of the wounds, the trajectory data, the timing relative to the engagement record. She held his gaze. I documented it because that's what medical personnel are supposed to do. The car was very quiet. I know, he said. It came out differently from the previous 2 times he'd said it. Smaller, or maybe just more honest. She sat with that for a moment. Then, you thought I was going to surface that when I turned up in Delwood. Garrett said you'd been asking questions. I hadn't. He said, Garrett was protecting himself, she said. He was already in an arrangement with Marsh that couldn't survive scrutiny. A nurse with a combat medical record and a documented history of filing accurate reports was a threat to him specifically. Not because of anything I might know about you, but because I was the kind of person who files accurate reports. She looked at him steadily. He told you what he needed to tell you to get you to apply pressure. And you applied it. Spade looked at the windshield. Outside, a city bus passed. A woman with a stroller navigated the sidewalk beside the state office's building. What did you tell Marsh? She said. Specifically. I told him... He stopped. Started again. I told him that there was a nurse at Harlow General with a military record that could become a problem if it attracted attention, that it would be worth finding grounds to move her on. He paused. I didn't know what Marsh was. I thought I was talking to a police officer with influence at a hospital. You were talking to a man who was running a fraud operation that targeted vulnerable patients, she said, and you gave him my file and told him I was worth targeting. He didn't say anything. Did you know about the fraud? No. She looked at him and decided that was probably true, not because she trusted him comprehensively, but because the logic of it didn't require him to know. Garrett had managed the Marsh-Spade connection and the Marsh-Fraud connection as separate compartments. That was how these things worked when they worked. Each party knew only what they needed to know to do their part. You're going to be named, she said, in Marsh's cooperation testimony, within 48 hours. The attorney told me. Spade's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A small settlement, like weight redistributing. I know, he said. I've already spoken to a lawyer. Then why are you here? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the bus at the corner had moved, and a delivery truck had taken its place, and the woman with the stroller had disappeared around the corner. Because I wanted to say it to your face, he said finally. What I did, pointing Marsh at you, was wrong. I don't have a version of it that makes it right. I was protecting something that didn't need protecting the way I thought it did, and I used bad judgment about who I was protecting it with, and a lot of people got hurt in ways that had nothing to do with the thing I was trying to protect. He paused. And you specifically got put in the middle of something you walked into by accident. She looked at him. It wasn't an accident, she said. I came back to the floor because a man needed antibiotics and the timing mattered. That was a decision, not an accident. I know that too. Then you know that everything that followed was also a decision. She reached for the door handle. The report I filed 4 years ago was accurate. If it ever needs to be revisited, it will still be accurate. That hasn't changed. She opened the door. Whatever happens with Marsh's testimony, whatever part of it involves you, cooperate fully. Tell the truth clearly. She paused. That's all anyone can do when the math catches up with them. She got out of the car. She didn't look back. Cross picked up on the first ring. I need to tell you something, she said. She was walking, away from the state offices, roughly south, no specific destination, just the forward motion of someone who needed her body to be doing something while her mind worked. About why I was targeted, the origin of it. She told him. All of it. Spade, the Kadir engagement, the report she'd filed, the transfer. She told it in the flat, sequential way she'd given testimony an hour ago. Precise, corrected where needed, flagged when observation rather than fact. She told it because Cross had clearance and history, and because he was possibly the only person in her current life who could hold all of it without needing her to simplify it or package it or explain why she'd stayed quiet for 4 years. He listened without interrupting. She appreciated that. She always had. When she finished, there was a pause. Not a shocked pause. A processing one. "The Kadir report," he said. "I heard about that engagement, not the details, just that there'd been a complicated after-action." "It was complicated because someone documented it accurately," she said. "Yeah." A pause. "He came to you in person. He came to say it was wrong. I think he meant it." She paused. "He's still going to be named, and he should be. Good intentions after the fact don't unwind the damage in the middle." "No," Cross said. "They don't." She turned a corner onto a side street, quieter residential fringe, the brick of older Dellwood buildings giving way to the kind of mixed-use blocks that had been something else before they were what they were now. A laundromat. A hardware store. An older man sitting on a front step with a coffee cup. "The state board wants me in an advisory capacity," she said, "to review the clinical culture at Harlow General." "Are you going to do it?" She looked at the street. "I've been thinking about that." "And?" "I've been thinking about 31 patients with altered records, about how long it ran, about the fact that there were people in that hospital who knew something was wrong and didn't say so, not because they were bad people, but because the system they were operating in had made silence feel like the only safe calculation." She paused. "And I've been thinking about Darius Holm, who was 24 years old and 18 months into his first healthcare job, and pulled security footage at 3 a.m. and sent it to a nurse he barely knew because he'd watched her and made a bet." "That's a yes," Cross said. "That's a yes," she said. The formal charges against Derek Marsh were made public the following Thursday. Nora was in the hospital when it broke across the news. She was on shift. She'd been back on shift for 3 days, and the ER had the specific altered quality of a room that has been through something and is in the early stages of figuring out what it is now. Different without Donnelly. Different without Garrett's mild, carefully managed presence at the edge of everything. Interim Director Mehta had called the staff meeting as promised and had spoken for 40 minutes without corporate language or carefully hedged formulations, had simply described what the review had found and what was going to be done about it, and had then opened the floor for questions and stayed for 2 hours answering them. Nora had sat in the back and said very little. She didn't need to say much. What needed to be said was already on the record, in multiple formats, in offices that were significantly more durable than any staff meeting. The charges against Marsh were extensive. Criminal counts relating to abuse of authority, evidence tampering, unauthorized patient record access, and conspiracy to commit billing fraud. 7 counts initially, with a public statement from the DA's office indicating more were likely to follow as the archive review continued. His badge had been formally revoked. The department was under external oversight. Garrett was charged on 9 counts, the medical board moving with a speed that suggested the evidence had been particularly unambiguous. His medical license was suspended pending criminal proceedings. The billing fraud component had been referred to federal prosecutors because the amounts and duration triggered federal jurisdiction. He'd retained counsel and had stopped talking publicly, which was the only smart decision anyone in his position could make at that point. Donnelly faced civil review and a board inquiry that looked, from the outside, like it was going to result in findings that precluded him from healthcare administration for a significant period. Whether criminal charges followed depended on what the email record showed about his knowledge of the fraud component. Spade was named in Marsh's cooperation testimony on the Thursday that the charges went public. The naming was specific and limited. His role was what it was, which was an outside actor who had provided targeting information without direct participation in the fraud itself. The military justice system was handling the implications of his conduct separately and parallel to the civilian investigation. His retirement did not shield him from that process, which was something she had not known for certain but had suspected, and which Cross confirmed through channels she didn't ask him to detail. She didn't feel satisfaction at any of it, precisely. She felt something more like the specific relief of watching a structure that had been leaning wrong for a long time finally get corrected. Not pleasurable, not triumphant, just correct. The right weight in the right place. Marcus Webb was discharged to a veteran support facility on the west side of Delwood on a Wednesday afternoon, 12 days after his admission. Nora wasn't on shift when it happened, but Sandra texted her. He asked about you before he left. I told him you'd been on nights. She texted back. How's his hand? Infection cleared. Full mobility assessment in 6 weeks. Social worker says he has a housing application in. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to the chart she'd been reviewing. Then she took it back out. Tell him I said good luck, she wrote. Sandra replied with a thumbs up. Then, 30 seconds later, he said, and I'm quoting exactly, she already knows. She looked at that for a moment. Then she put her phone away again. The board advisory role began 2 weeks after the formal charges. It was structured as a 6-month engagement, Nora working alongside a committee tasked with reviewing Harlow General's clinical governance, reporting structures, complaint escalation systems, and the specific failure points that had allowed the Marsh-Garrett arrangement to run for 3 years without detection. It was not comfortable work. It required sitting in rooms with people who had been part of the institution that had failed, asking them to account for decisions they would rather not examine. It required reading documentation that was alternately enraging and depressing, complaint after complaint that had gone nowhere, flagged anomaly after anomaly that had been attributed to administrative error or software inconsistency and filed away. It required, on 2 specific occasions, telling people things they didn't want to hear in terms that didn't allow them to avoid hearing it. She was not graceful about it every time. There was a meeting in the 3rd week where she sat across from a mid-level administrator who kept using the phrase systemic oversight failures to describe what had happened, and she finally said, flatly, that's a way of saying no one made a choice, but someone made each of these choices individually. Call them that. The administrator looked at her with the expression of someone who had expected this to be a different kind of meeting. She looked back until he nodded. She wasn't always right. She missed a documentation pattern in the 2nd month that a junior analyst on the committee spotted first, and she said good catch without qualifying it, which felt harder than it should have and also necessary. She disagreed with the committee chair, a woman named Dr. Lena Park, patient safety specialist from St. Louis, on the proposed timeline for the complaint escalation reforms, and the disagreement lasted 3 days and ended in a compromise that was, objectively, better than either of their original positions. She was not the hero of the committee's work. She was a participant in it, which was both less satisfying and more durable. Darius Holm got a formal commendation from the interim director at the 60-day mark. It was presented at a staff meeting that Nora attended in the back of the room, the same position she'd taken at the first meeting. Meta read the language of the commendation clearly, and without the performative warmth that these things sometimes got dressed in, just the facts of what he'd done and why it mattered and what it had contributed to. He was 24. He stood at the front of the room in his scrubs with his hands clasped in front of him, and the expression of someone who wasn't sure whether to be proud or embarrassed, and had landed somewhere in between. When it was done and people were clapping, he looked up and found Nora in the back of the room. She nodded once. He nodded back. That was all. It was enough. After the meeting, she stopped him in the corridor. The footage, she said. Why me? He looked at her for a moment. He had the kind of face that was still figuring out what it was going to settle into, young enough that the person he'd be at 40 wasn't fully visible yet in the person he was at 24. Because you came back, he said. They told you to leave and you came back and worked the whole night, and I thought, if there's anyone who's going to actually do something with it, it's her. You took a real risk, she said. I filed a complaint 8 months ago and it went in a drawer, he said. I know what no risk looks like in this place. It looks like doing nothing and watching the same things happen. He shrugged. Not dismissive, just honest. I'd rather take the risk. She looked at him for a moment. Have you thought about what you want to do, long term, in this field? I'm thinking about nursing school. You should do it, she said. She walked away before it could become a speech. The final hearing in Marsh's criminal case was set for a Thursday in October, 16 weeks after the night on Route 9. Nora was listed as a witness for the prosecution. So was Sandra. So was Darius Holm. So were 4 former patients, 3 of them veterans, whose records had been altered and who had been located through the advocacy group review and had agreed, after being approached and given time to decide, to provide testimony. She arrived at the courthouse in civilian clothes. Dark jacket, no badge, nothing that marked her as anything other than what she was, a witness who had something accurate to say and was there to say it. Marsh was in the courtroom when she took her seat in the witness waiting area. She caught a glimpse of him through the partly open door. A glimpse only, enough to see the suit and the absence of the uniform that had been the architecture of his authority for 6 years. He looked smaller, not in a way she took pleasure in, just in the way that things look their actual size when you remove the institutional framework that made them appear larger. She gave her testimony in 40 minutes. She was precise. She was corrected once by the defense attorney on a timestamp. She'd said 10:40. The record showed 10:44. And she said, yes, 10:44. Thank you without qualification or defensiveness. The defense attorney had expected the correction to rattle her, and it hadn't, which seemed to disconcert him more than it would have if she'd been rattled. When she left the stand, she didn't look at Marsh, not out of hostility, simply because there was nothing there she needed to see. She'd said what she'd come to say. His face wasn't relevant to whether it was true. The verdict came back 17 days later. She was not in the courthouse for it. She was in the ER, finishing a morning shift when Sandra found her at the station. Guilty, Sandra said. All 7 counts. Nora looked at her. Sentencing in 6 weeks, Sandra said. Her voice was quiet. Not celebratory. Neither of them were celebratory. More like 2 people standing at the end of something that had gone on a long time and required a moment to acknowledge. Garrett's plea agreement was finalized yesterday, too. He cooperated, which reduced some of the counts, but the federal billing fraud carries mandatory minimums. She paused. He's going to lose everything. The license, the position, everything. I know, Nora said. Does it feel like enough? She thought about that honestly. It feels like what it is, she said, which is accountability. Not the same as repair. The 31 patients with altered records aren't unaltered. The people who didn't say anything because the system made silence feel safe still have to live with that. She paused. But it's accountability. That's not nothing. Sandra was quiet for a moment, then, the morning Donnelly sent you home. If he hadn't. If there'd been no mass casualty event that night, I'd have filed a formal complaint in writing the next day, Nora said. Documented the corridor incident with Marcus Webb, Marsh's conduct, the administrative response. Put it on record. She paused. It might have taken longer. It might have gone somewhere or nowhere. But I'd have filed it. You were going to do this regardless. He was accessing a patient's file. That's not a hill I was going to walk around. She said it without drama, because it wasn't dramatic. It was just the threshold she operated at. It had been that threshold in a field tent in a different country, and it was that threshold in an ER in Delwood, Missouri. The geography changed. The threshold didn't. On a Friday afternoon in November, 5 months after the night of the Route 9 incident, Nora Vasquez sat in a conference room at the State Health Services board offices and delivered the final advisory report she'd spent 6 months helping to compile. It was 43 pages. It covered complaint escalation failures, documentation irregularities, administrative conflicts of interest, and the specific structural conditions that had allowed a 3-year fraud operation to run inside a hospital with 48 daily nursing staff and 11 attending physicians without being internally surfaced. It made 31 recommendations. Some of them would require legislative action. Some of them were operational changes that individual hospitals could implement within 90 days. Some of them were uncomfortable. They named specific failure modes and named the types of institutional behavior that enabled them, including the tendency of large organizations to reward the appearance of stability over the reality of accountability. It was not a document that made anyone feel good. That was, she'd decided, an indicator that it was accurate. Dr. Park, the committee chair, presented alongside her. They disagreed on 4 of the 31 recommendations up until the final week and had landed on language they both found defensible, which was different from language they were both entirely happy with. She'd said so in the room, which had made the board members look slightly startled. Park had backed her up, which she hadn't expected and which she appreciated. After the presentation, the board chair, a woman in her late 60s with the specific authority of someone who had been navigating institutional complexity for long enough to have stopped performing certainty, said, "This is the most direct report this board has received in 12 years. Nora said, "I hope that changes." The board chair looked at her. "If you're willing to continue in an advisory capacity beyond this engagement, we'd like to discuss that with you." She thought about her apartment on Keller Street, the second-hand coffee maker, the quiet she'd built. She thought about Marcus Webb's hand, about Darius Holm going to nursing school, about the 31 patients whose records had been altered and who deserved a system that was less corruptible than the one they'd moved through. She thought about the Kadir report, filed accurately and buried for 4 years, and about the specific cost of accurate documentation in environments that prefer comfortable versions of events, and about whether that cost had been worth paying. She decided it had. "Yes," she said, "Otto." She drove back to Delwood in the gray November afternoon with the heater on and the radio off. The interstate was thin of traffic, mid-afternoon, past the lunch rush, before the commute. The land on either side of the highway was flat and wide in the way Missouri gets in November, all the summer's density stripped back to the clean bones of it. She'd come to Delwood because it had a hospital with an opening. She'd needed somewhere quiet to land after years of noise. She'd gotten 3 months of quiet and then an overnight shift that had unraveled a 6-year operation and surfaced a 4-year secret and put her in rooms she hadn't planned to be in, doing things she hadn't planned to do. She hadn't planned any of it. That was the part that was hard to explain to people who wanted the story to be about courage, about the conscious choice to stand up, to speak out, to be the person who acts when others don't. That version was cleaner. It was also wrong. She'd pushed back on Marsh in that corridor because a man's hand was infected and the antibiotic timing mattered and someone was in the way. She'd come back to the floor because there were people who needed care and not enough staff to provide it. She'd forwarded the footage because it documented something that needed to be documented. None of those were heroic calculations. They were just what the situation required. And she'd done what the situation required because that was how she was built. Through years and experience and hard choices that had shaped the specific person she'd become. The specific person she'd become had costs. She knew that. The quiet she'd needed, the years of careful distance, the way she'd kept herself at a particular remove from institutional belonging. Those were the costs of the version of herself that had been built. She carried them. But they'd also produced a person who didn't flinch in a corridor at 3 a.m., who read fever in a person's skin before she read it on a monitor, who knew what it meant when a room's collective posture changed, who filed accurate reports even when accurate reports were inconvenient. Those things had mattered on the night of Route 9. They would matter again. Not because she was special. She wasn't. Not in the way that word usually gets applied. She was just specific. She'd been shaped by specific experiences into a person with specific capabilities, and those capabilities had been present in the right place at a moment when the right place needed them. She thought about what she'd said to the man in Donnelly's office, to Marcia's lowered voice and 6 years of institutional weight behind it. You did that yourself. She'd been talking about Marcus Webb's condition, but it was true of everything else, too. The entire structure. Marcia's authority, Donnelly's complicity, Garrett's careful management, Spade's miscalculation, had been built on the assumption that the people it was built around would stay small, would do the math of silence and find it came out in favor of quiet, would decide that the cost of pushing back exceeded the cost of looking away. And most of them had. Most people did. She understood that. She didn't exempt herself from the knowledge that she'd been quiet too, for years, about things she'd seen and documented and then watched be buried. Silence was rarely simple cowardice. It was usually something more complicated, a calculation made in conditions of genuine uncertainty, in contexts where the costs of speaking were real and the benefits were theoretical, but the calculation was still a choice. Every time it was made, it was a choice. And what the Harlow General report had found, across 43 pages and 31 recommendations, was that systems fail not because of single large acts of corruption, but because of 10,000 small choices in favor of quiet. Darius Holm had made a different choice. At 24, 18 months into his first healthcare job, with a prior complaint already buried and no particular reason to think this time would be different. He'd made a different choice because he'd watched a nurse come back to a floor she'd been told to leave, and he'd decided that was the kind of bet worth making. That was the thing that stayed with her. Not the investigation, not the charges, not the verdict. That, a kid in scrubs at 3 a.m. making a decision that nobody would have blamed him for not making. Small choices. All the way down. She took the exit for Delwood. Done. The ER was busy when she came in for her shift that evening. It was a Friday, which meant it would get busier. 3 beds already occupied when she clocked in, 2 more being set up, the specific organized energy of a unit getting ahead of what was coming. Sandra handed her the board at the nurse's station. Bay 2 is yours. 41-year-old, construction site fall, possible tibial fracture. Bay 4 is post-treatment waiting on labs. Got it. She clipped her badge to her scrubs. Started moving. Oh, Sandra said. Package came for you, at the station. She looked. A small flat envelope, her name on it in handwriting she didn't recognize. She picked it up. Inside was a card, plain, no design, and a printed photograph. The photograph was of Marcus Webb. He was standing outside a building, a low brick structure with a sign she could just read, Delwood Veterans Support Center. He was upright. His right hand was in his jacket pocket. He was not smiling exactly, but his face had something in it that hadn't been there when he'd been looking at the linoleum floor of the ER corridor. Something that looked like a man who had somewhere to be. The card said, "They gave me a room. First one in 2 years. Thank you for the timing." She looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she tucked it into her breast pocket, picked up the Bay 2 chart, and walked toward her patient. Behind her, the ER moved and breathed and did what ERs do. Absorbed the city's pain and applied the specific, imperfect, ongoing work of trying to fix what could be fixed and stabilize what couldn't. It wasn't heroic work. It was just necessary. It required people who showed up and did it with their whole attention and filed accurate reports and came back to floors they'd been told to leave when the situation required it. She was one of those people. She had always been one of those people. The difference was that now, in a hospital in Delwood, Missouri, the record reflected it. She pushed open the Bay 2 curtain. "Hi," she said. "My name's Nora. Tell me what happened." And she listened.